Today, I'm going to break one of the cardinal rules of woodworking. Yep, I'm going to talk about my mistakes. That's right, I'm going to talk about the mistakes that I made on last week's build, that planer cart, if you watched that video. Now, all woodworkers do it. I don't know if that extends to all other craftspeople, regardless of what they make, but I know woodworkers do it. You hand somebody a piece that you've made for them, and they say, "Oh, this is great, you made this yourself?" And then immediately we start pointing out all the things that we did wrong. Yeah, but the finish isn't quite right on this side, or I slipped with the chisel here, got a little bit of blood on it. And we know we shouldn't do it, but we do it anyway. We can't help ourselves. Now, there are a lot of YouTube channels that you watch, and they'll show you their mistakes that they've made while they're doing something, and I appreciate that. And that's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm hoping to show you some of the mistakes that I made on my cart so that you can see what I did wrong and hopefully not make the same mistakes on your own project. If you saw last week's video, you saw me build this cart, and you can go back and watch that if you haven't seen it. I'll put a link somewhere. What I want to show you are 5 mistakes that I made on this cart that, if you avoid those mistakes, you can have a better project. Now, the first couple of points are going to be about wood selection and grain direction. When I picked out the lumber for this project at the local home center, one thing I did do right was, well, I was pretty picky with the boards that I picked up. Again, it was the local home center. It was just standard construction grade 2x material. But I looked for boards that were straight and had very straight grain. And a lot of times in 2x4s and 4x4s, if you look at the end grain of the wood, you'll find that a lot of times those boards in particular are pulled from the very center of the tree, and you can see rings of the tree running from the core of that board out. And those are the least stable pieces of wood because the grain doesn't really have one direction the whole way through, and it's going to twist and warp. So what I did was I chose boards that had the grain running across the board as much as possible. What I failed to do, however, was to match that grain up when I laid out the project. As you can see here, the legs don't match from any angle. From the front, from the sides, I did not orient the boards so that the grain was the same direction from any side of the cart. Here I have a representation of the 4 legs of my cart. Now, you can see in the wood that I got, the grain is relatively straight. It's still, as you can see, taken from the center of the tree, but the grain does run out to the edges of the board, giving you nice tight grain on the sides, and then the flat grain on the ends. One thing I could have done when I laid these out is chosen ahead of time what I wanted the sides of the cart to look like as far as the legs go. I could have gone with flat grain on one side, and then on the ends of the cart you would see all side grain here, nice tight side grain. But instead I kind of messed that up, and I've got, flat with side and side with flat, and they're all messed up. And this is something that you have to plan for at the beginning of your project, is decide what look you're going for and think about the view of all the sides of your project and what you want the grain to look like. And that might even come down to whether or not you're going to paint the piece or stain the piece, how you're going to handle it. Choosing the correct grain direction is one thing I could have done. Now, once you've decided how you want the grain to look, one way that you can make sure that the pieces stay in the order that you want them to, so during milling or doing the joinery, you don't confuse the pieces, is you take a pencil, some kind of marker, and you draw some kind of a design on there so that when the pieces get separated, when you put them back together, you know which way they go. The second mistake is pretty closely related to the first one, and that's defects in your lumber. Now when I went to the store, I was focused on getting straight pieces of lumber, which is the most important. And I was also looking for straight tight grain in the lumber. To a third extent, I was also looking for boards with a lack of defects. Now, that's going to be tough to do in most home centers. You don't get the clearest lumber at the home center. So my boards had a couple of defects. What I did not do was minimize them. I had enough 4x4 left over. I probably could have cut a fifth leg if I had noticed that this knot hole was so prominent. Some knot holes are okay, and the wood's all filled in and it's tight and it's not going to go anywhere. This one, it's got some missing wood from it, and so it's just kind of unsightly. You should always lay out the pieces of your project so that they avoid the defects as much as possible. I probably could have cut the legs around this, looking at the amount of material I have left over, so this is on me. However, if you're laying out your project and you find that you don't quite have enough to avoid the defects that are there, what you should do then is hide the defects. Now on this one, I've already talked about the grain direction and how this grain direction is different than that leg over there. Had I rotated this leg 90 degrees before I cut the joinery on this leg, this knot hole would have been to the inside. It would have been less noticeable. In the future, if I decide to put plywood on the inside of this cabinet to make shelves or to make drawers, the plywood would be sitting over top of this knot hole and it would never be seen. So the takeaway is defects. Avoid them if you can, hide them if you can't. Now this next one might just tell more about me than it should, but I guess that would be pay attention. When you're cutting the tenons on these legs, it can get a little bit confusing. Now, one way I could have done it was just mark one leg, set it up, and then made all identical cuts on the table saw, and they all would have been exactly the same. I wouldn't have had to measure and mark each one. But as you saw in the video last week, I did take the time to measure and mark each one, and I still messed it up. You can see down here, I rotated the wrong direction and I made a cut on a side where I shouldn't have made a cut, and it took a notch out of this board that should not have been taken out. So that's on me. But still, pay attention. Even though you have marked and laid everything out, it is still possible when you're cutting these things to put the wrong side down. So, you know, do as I say and not as I do, and you can save yourself some headaches. Now while this is on its side, let's talk about something else. See, these gaps here are just a little too big. Now part of this is the joinery, which we'll get to later. But part of it is also because construction lumber comes with a little bit of a rounded edge. Now when you're trying to put pieces together tight that are going to join edge to edge like this, it helps to have a nice square corner. So one thing I could have done to tighten up these joints somewhat is to mill this lumber just a little bit. Again, it's construction grade lumber, but nothing says you can't run it through a planer or a joiner and take just a little bit off the outside on all four sides to make this corner just a little more crisp. That way you don't have this slightly rounded top and bottom, and you can get a much cleaner joint when you're doing cuts like this. Which brings me to my last mistake. Now my last mistake was perpetrated here at the table saw. The joints on the cart, as you saw, are a little bit wide. Gaps at the legs and the top where they all join is a little bit wide. And as you saw from last week's episode, the top that I have is inset into the 2x4 border around the top. Now that isn't exactly flush. You can see here there's a little bit of a lip between the top and the edges. And I think what I did there was not having the table saw set up properly. Now I measured between the table and the top of the blade, but that didn't take into account the zero clearance insert. Now when I installed this thing, it has a little bit of a hump to it in the middle, and I never quite got it pressed the whole way back out. So there's still a little bit of a gap. And as you can see by this ruler, there's still some light shining on both sides of this zero clearance insert, allowing the cut to be a little less deep than the measurement between the tabletop and the top of the teeth. So what that gave me when I ran all the joints across there was a little bit too shallow of a cut that I didn't go back and remeasure and correct when I had a chance to. So I guess that last lesson is double check the work. Don't just trust the measurement that you get. Check the actual piece and make sure you're getting the measurement that you want. Now granted, in this case, this is just shop furniture. But if you follow these practices on the cheaper wood, when you go to throw down your hard-earned cash for the expensive hardwood, or if you're doing it for a client's project, then these practices will be ingrained. You won't have to worry about making these mistakes again. Until next time, I hope all of your projects are mistake-free, unlike mine.